I need a wife by tomorrow. Before you find out why a man who looked like he wrestled the devil and won would say something so desperate, you should know that the silence in my shop was usually my only companion. It was a good silence. It remembered my husband, Lynn, and the ghost of his laughter that still lived in the scent of dried herbs and stacked bolts of cotton. The man who shattered that quiet was called Deacon. He didn't have another name, or if he did, the dust of the trail had worn it away. He stood in my doorway, a figure carved from hardship and shadow, blocking the brutal summer sun. The town of Redemption was afraid of him. They said he carried the sins of 10 men and the aim of a specter. He was a whisper, a warning, a reason to bolt your doors. He never came into town for more than salt and bullets, and he never spoke to anyone but me, and even then only to trade coin for rice with a clipped nod. But today he spoke. His voice was like rocks grinding together, low and rough and final. I need a wife by tomorrow. My hands, which were measuring out lentils into a paper sack, stilled. The tiny gray stones froze in their scoop. I looked up at him. His eyes were the color of a stormy sky, and for the first time I saw they weren't cold. They were burning with a terrifying, raw panic that made the gun on his hip look like a child's toy. I placed the scoop down, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden stillness. My gray Cheong Sam, the one I had worn every day since Lynn died, felt thin, my only armor against the sheer force of his presence. I could feel the eyes of Mrs. Gable from the bakery across the street peering through her window. This was the most interesting thing to happen in Redemption since the last flash flood. I finally found my voice, a thing I thought I'd misplaced. I do not sell wives, Mr. Deacon, only dry goods. He took a step inside, and the bell above the door gave a nervous, tinny jingle. He smelled of dust and leather and something metallic, like old blood or fresh rain. I know, he said, his gaze fixed on me unwavering. It ain't a purchase. It's a proposal, of a kind. My heart, a slow and steady drum of grief, picked up a frantic, unfamiliar rhythm. I thought of Lynn, of the quiet dignity of our life together, a life of shared glances and comfortable silences. This man was the opposite of silence. He was a whole storm system crammed into the frame of a man. I should have said no. I should have pointed to the door and told him to take his madness elsewhere. Any sensible woman would have. But I saw the tremor in his large, calloused hands. I saw the way his jaw was clenched so tight a muscle jumped near his ear. This wasn't a threat. It was a plea, wrapped in the only language he knew, command. I looked past the reputation that clung to him like burrs, past the formidable size of him, and I asked the only question that truly mattered, the one that bloomed in my mind not out of curiosity, but from a deep, aching place of understanding loss. What happens to the child if you fail? His composure cracked. It was just for a second, a hairline fracture in a granite slab, but I saw it. The storm in his eyes faltered, revealing a landscape of pure desolation. Her name is Fay, he said, the words costing him more than all the gold in the territory. She's my brother's girl. He and his wife, they're gone. The circuit judge comes through tomorrow. He won't give her to a single man with a reputation like mine. They'll send her to the workhouse in St. Joseph. She's 7. He stopped, the shame and fury warring on his face. He was asking me to help him save a child. He was asking me, a woman who couldn't even save her own husband from a fever. The irony was a bitter pill. But Fay, a 7-year-old girl. I thought of the silence in my own small rooms behind the shop, a silence that would swallow a child whole. His homestead, I'd heard, was miles out, a lonely speck in a vast, uncaring wilderness. I looked at my hands, resting on the worn wooden counter Lynn had built. They were empty. They had been empty for 2 years. It would be an arrangement, I said, my voice quiet but firm. A contract, in name only. He nodded, relief washing over his features so profoundly he seemed to shrink an inch. In name only, he agreed, his voice hoarse. You'll have your own room. You won't want for anything. I need you to stand there. Tomorrow. I took a slow breath, the air thick with the scent of cinnamon in his desperation. I will stand there. The next morning was a blur of judgment. Not from the circuit judge, a portly man with sweat stains under his arms who seemed more interested in his lunch, but from the entire town of Redemption. They stood in a silent, accusing line as I walked from my shop to the makeshift courthouse. I wore the same gray cheongsam. It was the only dress I owned that held any sense of occasion, even if the occasion was my own funeral. Deacon stood waiting, looking cleaner than I'd ever seen him, his hair damp and combed back from his forehead. He didn't look at me. The judge mumbled words from a book. Deacon grunted his assent, and when it was my turn, I whispered, "I do." It felt like a lie, and the truest thing I'd ever said, all at once. There was no ring, just a piece of paper, signed and stamped, that declared me on way, wife of Deacon. Then it was over. He led me to a wagon packed with my few belongings, a trunk of clothes, my mother's porcelain tea set, and the herbs that were too precious to leave behind. The journey to his homestead was made in silence. The rattling of the wagon wheels was the only conversation between us. The land grew emptier with every mile, the sparse trees giving way to vast, sun-scorched plains that stretched to a hazy blue horizon. It was a beautiful, terrible place, a land that promised nothing and would take everything if you let it. I watched the muscles in Deacon's back move as he handled the reins. He was a part of this landscape, weathered and unyielding. I was a willow tree trying to take root in a rock slide. When we finally arrived, the house was just as I'd imagined. A simple, sturdy cabin of hewn logs, with a stone chimney and a sagging porch. It was stark, a fortress against the wilderness, not a home. And on that porch, a small girl with hair the color of straw and eyes as wide and wary as a deer's stood clutching a faded rag doll. This was Fay. She didn't run to him. She didn't smile. She just watched as I, the strange woman in the strange dress, climbed down from the wagon. Her gaze was old, filled with a grief that no 7-year-old should ever know. Deacon's voice was unnaturally soft when he spoke to her. "Fay, this is An Way. She's going to be staying with us." The girl said nothing. Her silence was louder than the town's whispers, more accusing than their stares. She looked at me, and I saw a loneliness that mirrored my own. In that moment, the contract, the arrangement, it all faded away. This was no longer about a desperate man or a lonely widow. It was about this child, this tiny, shattered soul standing on a porch in the middle of nowhere. My purpose here wasn't to be a wife. It was to mend what was broken. The first days were a careful dance of avoidance. We were 3 solitary planets orbiting a cold sun, each keeping to our own silent, predictable path. I claimed the small back room as my own, its single window looking out over the endless prairie. I unpacked my mother's tea set, arranging the delicate cups on a rough-hewn shelf, a small pocket of grace in the rugged cabin. Deacon was a phantom. He rose before the sun, the scrape of his boots on the floorboards my only alarm clock, and he returned long after dusk, smelling of earth and sweat. He would eat the meal I left for him on the table, his fork and knife making small, lonely sounds in the quiet kitchen. He never complimented the food, but the plate was always clean. I learned the geography of his grief through the tasks he set for himself, mending fences that were not yet broken, chopping wood far in excess of what we would need for winter, as if he could exhaust the guilt that pursued him. Faye was my shadow, a silent observer in my new life. She would watch me from doorways, her small face peeking around the frame, disappearing the moment I turned to look. She watched me knead bread, my hands remembering the rhythms Lynn had loved. She watched me tend to the small, neglected patch of earth by the cabin, my fingers coaxing life from the dry, reluctant soil. I didn't speak to her much, knowing that words were a currency she was not yet willing to trade. Instead, I communicated in offerings. A small, smooth river stone left on her windowsill, a sprig of wild lavender placed on her pillow, a perfectly ripe berry set beside her plate at breakfast. The items would always be gone when I checked later, spirited away to a secret hoard I imagined. I never saw her take them, but I knew she did. In the evenings, after the menial tasks of survival were done, the silence of the cabin would press in on me. It was a heavier silence than the one in my shop. That one was filled with memory. This one was filled with absence, with the ghosts of a family that should have been, with words unspoken and sorrows unshared. I would sit by my window, sipping jasmine tea from one of my mother's cups, and wonder if I had traded one prison for another. A storm broke the fragile peace. It came on suddenly one afternoon, the sky turning a bruised purple gray. The wind rose to a tormented howl, rattling the window panes and clawing at the roof. Rain came down not in sheets, but in solid, angry waves that battered the little cabin. It was a violent, primal force, as if the desolate land itself was trying to scrub us from its face. As night fell, the storm intensified. Thunder cracked directly overhead, a sound so loud it seemed to split the world in two, followed by the blinding white flash of lightning that illuminated the room in stark, terrifying detail. It was in the brief silence after one such crack that I heard it, a small, choked cry from Faye's room. I rose from my chair, my book falling to the floor, and moved down the short, dark hallway. The door to her room was slightly ajar. I pushed it open to see Deacon standing there, frozen just inside the doorway. In the flickering lamplight, he looked huge and helpless, a mountain unable to move a pebble. Faye was sitting up in her bed, her small body trembling, her face buried in her hands as she let out another terrified sob. Deacon took a half step toward her, his hand outstretched, then let it fall to his side. He didn't know how to cross the chasm of her fear. He knew how to face down armed men, how to survive a blizzard, but he was utterly lost in the face of a little girl's tears. I moved past him, my slippers silent on the wooden floor. I didn't go to the bed. I simply pulled the small rocking chair from the corner and sat near the foot of it, a quiet anchor in her sea of terror. I began to hum. It was a simple, tuneless melody from my childhood, a lullaby my mother used to sing to me when I was afraid of the dark. It had no words, just a soft, steady sound that promised safety. I didn't look at Faye. I just hummed into the darkness, my voice a quiet counterpoint to the raging storm outside. After a few moments, her sobs subsided into shudders. She peeked at me through her fingers. I kept humming. Deacon hadn't moved from the doorway. He was watching us, and in the next flash of lightning, I saw his face. The rigid mask of the hardened gunslinger was gone. In its place was a look of such profound, aching sorrow it stole my breath. It was a sorrow I recognized. It was the face of a man watching a life he couldn't save. The storm raged on, but inside the little cabin something had shifted. The three of us were no longer separate planets. For the first time, we were a constellation, huddled together in the dark. The world was washed clean the next morning. The sun shone with a gentle warmth, and the air smelled of damp earth and sagebrush. The storm had passed, and it had taken the sharpest edges of our tension with it. When I entered the kitchen, Deacon was already there, pouring coffee into 2 tin mugs. He pushed one across the table toward me. "Thank you," he said. Just 2 words, but they were heavy with the unspoken weight of the night before. I simply nodded and accepted the mug, the heat of it a comfort in my hands. The day unfolded with a new, softer rhythm. I went out to my small garden to assess the storm's damage. A few tomato plants were battered, but they would survive. As I worked, tamping the soil around their bases, I felt a presence. I looked up to see Faye standing at the edge of the garden patch, her bare feet dusty. She was watching my hands in the dirt. I didn't say anything, just continued my work. After a long moment, she bent down, her small fingers carefully pulling a stubborn weed from the soil. She walked over to me and held it out, a silent offering. My heart swelled. I took the weed from her as if it were a precious jewel. "Sheh," I whispered. "Thank you." She didn't respond, just retreated to the edge of the garden. But she didn't leave. She stayed, watching, for the rest of the morning. Later that day, I was gathering eggs from the coop when Deacon came to repair a broken latch on the small door. We worked in the small enclosed space, the scent of hay and chickens thick around us. It was the closest we had been physically, our shoulders nearly brushing as I reached into a nesting box and he hammered a nail. It should have been awkward, but it wasn't. There was a simple, shared purpose to our movements. We were 2 people caring for a home. It was a startling thought. I began to notice things about him I hadn't before. The way he was surprisingly gentle with the chickens, shooing them away from his tools with a soft murmur. The precision in his large hands as he worked the damaged wood. He was a man built for destruction. Yet here he was, carefully, painstakingly, building things back up. That evening, as I swept the porch, I watched him with Faye. He was showing her how to skip a stone across the water trough. He didn't smile, not really, but the grim line of his mouth had softened. And for the first time, I heard Faye laugh. It was a small, rusty sound, like a hinge that hadn't been used in a long time. But it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The past arrived on a Sunday, riding a tired-looking horse. His name was Fletcher, a man from Deacon's former life, with a mean-spirited grin and eyes that saw everything as a weakness to be exploited. He dismounted without being invited and swaggered onto the porch where I was shelling peas. "Well, well, Deacon," Fletcher drawled, his eyes sweeping over me with a dismissive smirk. "Heard you got yourself civilized. Even got a little China doll to keep house." Deacon appeared in the cabin doorway, his body instantly rigid, his hands loose at his sides. He was the gunslinger again, the dangerous man from the town's whispers. "You're not welcome here, Fletcher," Deacon said, his voice a low growl. Fletcher just laughed, a nasty, grating sound. "Came to see the girl, the one you made an orphan." The words hung in the hot, still air, venomous and sharp. I saw Faye, who had been playing by the water trough, freeze. Her small face went pale. "Get off my land," Deacon repeated, his voice dropping even lower. "Or what?" Fletcher taunted. "Gonna shoot me? Like you shot your own brother? An accident, wasn't it? Funny how your accidents always leave you with something to gain. First his land, now his girl." The accusation was brutal, designed to inflict maximum pain. Deacon didn't move, but I saw the agony that washed over his face. This was his guilt, the ghost that haunted this homestead. This was the reason for his silence, his penance. I stood up, the bowl of peas rattling in my hands. I set it down carefully on the porch railing. I would not let this man poison our fragile peace. That evening, after Fletcher had finally gone, driven off by a silence from Deacon that was more menacing than any threat, the truth came out. We sat at the kitchen table, the lamp casting long shadows. Fay was asleep. "He was my younger brother, Thomas," Deacon said, his voice rough with unshed grief. "We were pinned down by a posse, a misunderstanding over stolen cattle. I was providing cover fire. A ricochet. It hit Thomas. It was my bullet." He stared at his hands on the table as if they were foreign objects, capable of monstrous things. "I killed my own brother. I took his wife, Mary, and Fay, and ran. Mary, she wasted away from the grief. Died 6 months ago. Fletcher is right. I made Fay an orphan." He finally looked at me, his eyes filled with self-loathing. "I am poison, Anway. I ruin everything I touch." I listened, my heart aching for him, for the crushing weight he carried. When he was finished, I reached across the table and laid my hand on his. "My husband Lynn," I said softly, "died from a fever. For 3 days I brewed herbs, I bathed him in cool water, I prayed to every god I knew. Nothing worked. I watched him die, and I was helpless. I touch things, and they break too." We sat there, our hands clasped together over the worn wood, two broken people finding solace in our shared scars. We were not poison. We were just survivors. The confession hung between us, not as a wall, but as a bridge. The pretense of our arrangement dissolved in the shared crucible of our grief. We were no longer a gunslinger and the widow he'd bought, but a man and a woman bound by something deeper than a piece of paper from a circuit judge. The silence in the cabin changed. It was no longer empty, but filled with a quiet understanding. We began to talk, not just about the necessities of the farm, but about small things. He told me about the way the light hit the canyon at dawn. I told him about the markets in my home village, the scent of star anise and roasting ducks. Our conversations were hesitant at first, like learning a new language, but they slowly built a new foundation for our life together. The word "we" began to appear naturally. "We should plant corn next to the tomatoes," I'd say, and he would nod. "We need to patch the roof before the first snow," he would mention, and I would add it to our mental list. It was a subtle shift, but it changed everything. We were a unit, a partnership. I started to see him not as the town saw him, a figure of fear and violence, but as the man he was trying to be. The man who taught his niece how to fish in the creek, his large hands impossibly gentle as he baited her hook. The man who would listen, truly listen, as I spoke of my life before redemption, his stormy eyes soft with an emotion I was not yet brave enough to name. One evening we were both on the porch, watching Fay chase fireflies in the twilight, their tiny lanterns blinking in the growing dark. She was laughing, that beautiful, rusty-hinged laugh that was becoming more and more frequent. A comfortable quiet settled between us. "She's happy here," he said, his voice low. "Because of you." I shook my head. "She's happy because she has a home. We are her home." I felt his gaze on me, intense and searching. I turned to meet it, and the air grew thick. The space between us hummed with a quiet energy, a possibility that was both terrifying and wonderful. He was so close. All I had to do was lean forward. All he had to do was reach out. Neither of us moved. It wasn't time. Not yet. but the promise of it lingered in the twilight, as bright and hopeful as the fireflies dancing in the dusk. The slow burn of our strange courtship was beginning to glow, warming the cold, lonely corners of my heart. Our peace was a fragile thing, and Fletcher returned to shatter it. This time he wasn't alone. He brought 2 other men with him, rough-looking drifters with cruel mouths and hungry eyes. They rode up to the homestead late one afternoon, their horses trampling my young cornstalks. They carried rifles. My blood ran cold. Fay, who was helping me hang laundry, scurried behind my skirts, her small hands clutching the fabric of my cheongsam. Deacon came out of the barn, a pitchfork in his hand, his body a rigid line of fury. He stopped 10 feet from the porch. "I told you to leave us be, Fletcher," Deacon said, his voice deceptively calm. "We're here to collect a debt," Fletcher sneered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near my feet. "This land belonged to your brother. By rights it should be sold, the money put in trust for the orphan. We're here on behalf of the town's concerned citizens to see that justice is done." It was a lie, a flimsy excuse for a land grab, but it was a dangerous one. They saw Deacon's new life not as a redemption, but as a weakness. A man with a family was a man with things to lose. Deacon's first instinct was written all over his face. He glanced at me and Fay, a flicker of panic in his eyes. He wanted to send us away, to hide us, to face this alone as he had always faced everything. He wanted to push us out of the line of fire, to revert to the lone wolf, believing his isolation was our only protection. Before he could speak, before he could tell me to take the girl and run, I stepped forward. Fay clung to my leg, but I did not falter. I met Fletcher's gaze, my back straight, my chin high. "This is our home," I said, my voice clear and steady, carrying across the dusty yard. "We are not leaving." Deacon looked at me, his expression a mixture of shock and something else, something akin to awe. He had expected me to be afraid, to be the woman he had to protect. He did not expect me to be his shield. I turned my attention back to Fletcher. I had no weapon. My only defense was the truth. "You are not concerned citizens," I said, my voice cutting through his bluster. "You are thieves. You see a man building a life, a child finding happiness, and you want to tear it down for a few acres of dust. There is no justice in that, only greed. Leave now." Fletcher laughed, but it was strained. The other 2 men shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting from me to the silent, imposing figure of Deacon, who now stood directly behind me, his presence a dark and solid promise of violence. They had come expecting to intimidate a broken man. They found a family instead. My quiet resolve had done more than a gun ever could. It had shown them that we were united, a force they hadn't anticipated. Fletcher's smirk faltered. He looked at my unyielding face, at the terrified child clinging to my dress, and at the deadly stillness of the man standing guard over us both. He spat on the ground one last time, a pathetic gesture of defiance. "This ain't over," he snarled, but his threat was hollow. He wheeled his horse around, and the 3 of them rode away, leaving us in a cloud of their dust and failure. The dust settled, both literally and figuratively. The trampled corn was a small price to pay for the victory we had won. We had faced down the ghost of Deacon's past together, and we were still standing. That evening, a new kind of peace descended upon the cabin. It was not the fragile, tentative peace of before, but something solid and earned. Fay, exhausted by the day's fear and excitement, fell asleep soon after dinner, her rag doll held tight in her arms. Deacon and I sat on the porch steps, watching the stars begin to prick the deep indigo canvas of the sky. For a long time, we didn't speak. There was no need. The silence was comfortable, a shared blanket against the cooling night air. He finally broke it, his voice low and sincere. "I was going to tell you to run," he admitted, staring out at the dark horizon. "It's what I've always done, kept people away. Figured it was the only way to keep them safe from me." He turned to look at me, his face illuminated by the pale moonlight. "I was wrong. You were braver than I was today, Anway." I shook my head. "It is not bravery to protect one's home." "This is your home, then?" he asked, his voice laced with a raw, vulnerable hope. It was the question that lay beneath everything, the one we had been circling for months. Was this just an arrangement, or was it something real? I met his gaze, my heart beating a steady, certain rhythm. "Yes," I said, "it is." He reached out then, his large, calloused hand covering mine where it rested on the wooden step. His touch was warm and firm, a grounding presence. It was not a gesture of passion, but of profound connection, a silent acknowledgement of everything we had become to each other. "I don't want this to be a deal anymore, Anway," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't want you to be my wife in name only." I looked at our joined hands, then back to his face, at the storm in his eyes that had finally calmed, leaving a sky clear and full of promise. I thought of the lonely, grieving woman who had stood behind her shop counter, and the desperate, haunted man who had walked in and shattered her silence. We had taken the broken pieces of our lives, and against all odds, built something new, something strong, something beautiful. "I don't either, Deacon," I whispered. He squeezed my hand, a small, simple gesture that held the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. We sat there for a long time under the vast, starry sky, no longer just surviving, but beginning, finally, to live.